Good evening, Rotary colleagues in peace. I'm Jim Halderman, the chair of District 5450 Peace Committee. Tonight, we have the opportunity to learn the reality in Sudan. I assume you've read the extensive background of our presenter, Peter Van Arsdale. He's an anthropologist, an educator, an author, a lecturer. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's actually, we're going to feature South Sudan. We'll touch on Sudan, but we're featuring South Sudan. So, crisis and chaos, as I mentioned in my lecture title. I'll share some good things tonight as best I can, but a lot of the news I have to share tonight is disappointing, sad, heart-rendering. That's what we have to do as we discuss the issues in South Sudan. As I told Jim, who's been my friend for many years, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I pulled some pictures, and these three pictures, I'm just going to show them to you right away to set the stage. Is the only pictures I'm going to have. Otherwise, you get to look at my face the rest of the presentation. I'll talk for 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A and be open to any and all comments, questions, and critiques. So here's the first picture. Those are soldiers, South Sudanese soldiers. That's the first group that you have to consider. Here's the second picture. Here's a man named Dengit. There he is, politician, cheered on by his onlookers in South Sudan. That's the second kind of a person you have to consider. And then here's the third kind that, as an anthropologist, I'm particularly, as you can guess, most interested in considering. A lady named Toka, sitting there without money, without resources, hungry children, desperate. Those three photos, a military photo, a political photo, and an everyday person's photo, absolutely set the stage for what we can consider pro and con. So, my friends, we have a good group. I like the size of this group because we'll have just enough people to interchange, discuss, chat as we go on. But let me start with this. To set the stage, I'll be giving you a contemporary overview, and then I'm going to go back in time because I know people like Jim and others are very interested in history. I know my friend Bob Rose is, and so I will go back in history a bit. But to set the stage for now, worldwide, we're at a phase 5 catastrophic hunger level as defined by various organizations, including the United Nations. What does it mean to be at a 5-phase catastrophic hunger level? It means simply that a majority of your population is basically in crisis mode, is food insecure. What are the 5 countries? You folks are well versed. You can guess what the 5 countries are that are in the most severe 5-phase level. They are South Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, all 3 of those in the Horn of Africa, and then Yemen and Afghanistan. Those are the 5 in our world that are at an absolute crisis level. So here's the current, basically as of this week in South Sudan, and then we'll go back. South Sudan is in what we call, pardon the academic term, but it's a good term, a syndemic. It's a confluence of pandemics. When you have a confluence of crises, and a confluence of what might be called various kinds of pandemics, and I don't mean just the health kind, but other kinds as well, you have a syndemic, multiple crises intersecting. South Sudan, for starters, has the 3F crisis, which is the fertilizer, fuel, and food crisis. All of those are critically important. Those, of course, have been exacerbated, as we all well know, by the Ukrainian-Russian war, because, in fact, some of those goods used to come, particularly some wheat, from places like Ukraine. That's not happening now in South Sudan. What are some of the other current issues? A woman named Christine Dire, South Sudanese woman, has a child that weighs half of what he should weigh prior to 1 year of age. There are literally thousands of people. We don't know how many thousands. I'm cautious about statistics when the statistics are not easy to come by, but thousands of people whose children are at half or less of the weight that they should have for their proportionate ages. The malnourishment and the lack of food is critical. Mesfin Loha, L-O-H-A, a gentleman who works for the World Vision and who is on site, has reported some of this, and I'm sharing some of his reporting with you here. What about school? That's in crisis mode. Are schools operating? Yes, they are. But with, in some cases, about $100 a year needed to keep a child in school, much of that $100 having to come from the family, you can guess that's like $1 million to us. Most of the families in the rural areas do not have that amount of money. Thus, many of the kids are not able to attend school. Many kids are in school, but many kids are not in school. What about the numbers? We don't know how many people currently live in South Sudan, but we can guess, if we also count refugees, about 11 or 12 million people live in South Sudan. Far more live in Sudan. And we'll briefly talk about Sudan in a little while, but this is mainly South Sudan. Of those numbers, about 2 million, probably a little more than 2 million, have exited Sudan to refugee camps. Sudan is bounded by 6 different countries. Now, not all of those 6 bounding countries receive refugees from South Sudan, but several do. You can guess that not many would go to the Central African Republic or to the Congo, where things are equally as tough. But large numbers of refugees go in the direction of Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, or Sudan. So over 2 million, and of course some have gone elsewhere too, but over 2 million, many of them to those neighboring countries, particularly those 4 that I just mentioned. Now we have to go on to what's happening inside. There are probably 2 million internally displaced people, IDPs, in South Sudan. So if you look at the 2 million plus refugees and the 2 million or so internally displaced people, right there, you're talking about a third of the entire South Sudanese population under IDP or refugee duress. Those numbers at that proportion for their total population are virtually unprecedented. Now, the latest statistics I pulled, and they vary because, of course, these are estimates, probably 50 to as much as 75% of the overall population, including the IDPs and the refugees who've gone to neighboring countries, are food insecure. Perhaps, we don't know exact numbers, but perhaps as many as 50 to 75% are food insecure. Now, what further issues are there in this syndemic, this confluence of negative forces? Just as we've been seeing in Pakistan with the devastating floods, they haven't been quite that bad in South Sudan, but I can assure you over the last year and a half, the flooding in areas, particularly Jonglei State, Equatoria State, some other states, there are 10 states in South Sudan, the flooding has been terrible. One of my colleagues, his name is Daniel, I'll give you just his first name. His second name is Guy. He has several names. we'll call him Daniel Guy. One of my colleagues sent me a picture of himself in his town. His town is Bor, B-O-R, and he was standing in waist-deep water on the way to school, where he helps teenage girls at that school. Waist-deep water in his town, attempting to get to school. It's hard to think of when we have the stereotype of a place like South Sudan. You may kind of think of it as certainly desolate, which it is, but maybe dry or with a savanna. Well, they have those things too, but there are tremendous areas, not only adjacent to the Nile, but beyond, that are very flood prone. And in the last 2 years, worse. So that's the additional compounding factor. Now, what about the next element of the syndemic? In the last 2 years, there have been plagues of locusts. Not only there, but I'm sure you've heard they've been elsewhere, Somalia, Ethiopia, but in the area of the Horn of Africa. Plagues of locusts. Now, sorghum is one of the key crops that folks try to grow. That's been devastated, as have others, by locusts and by too much water in some cases in fields, in farmers' fields. Well, this, in a moment, I'll finish this ominous overview by saying that then we have to talk about the political situation. I've been giving you some of the other infrastructural and food security and water-related issues. The political situation, further compounding this syndemic, clashes, as of this month, as best as we can tell, of the 10 South Sudanese states, clashes of various types have been occurring in 9 of the 10 South Sudanese states. That's according to the UN Human Rights Council. Now, this includes several kinds of clashes, which are historically very important to understand for this country. And before, when it was still part of Sudan, 12 years ago and back, and we'll get to a little bit of that. The clashes are between government and opposition governmental forces. There are kind of 2 forces at play there. And with militias. I remember this guy who was a friend of mine, a South Sudanese friend of mine from Denver, who moved back to South Sudan several years ago, back to the capital, Juba. And this friend of mine, I guess I'm not going to call him a friend longer. Once he was in, trying to whistle in with some of the politicians and work his way up, which happens to so many people in so many different countries, he formed his own paramilitary. That's what people do. And they are able to do it with the resources he had. That was the very man. And I'm not going to use his name because I remain too irritated at him to use his name. That was the same man who drove me in his Jeep to the edge of Juba a decade ago, the very edge of the capital, on a very nice ride we had, and introduced me to a woman who had a small entrepreneurial stall. It was the last stall in Juba before you went into the outback. It was the last stall. We went up, we met this woman. She said hi. And then she held up her cell phone and said, "Hey, look it, I'm doing business with a cell phone." These are the things that happen. And so many people there hang on in part because they have cell phones and they, in fact, have connectivity. Even this woman in a small stall on the outskirts of Juba. So it's an interesting and unusual place. That's the next thing I'm sharing. Now, in addition, the tradition of cattle, of course, we all know is tremendously important to people in the Horn of Africa. No less so in South Sudan. Sometimes, if a cow or steer is stolen, and cattle raids are very common, the rebuttal, the revenge, especially if it's a particularly valuable piece of livestock, is the taking of someone else's life, a human life. That doesn't always happen. It does sometimes, or a type of cattle raid. And cattle raids, even now, are going on very often, and people are often killed or maimed during these cattle raids, which are often transethnic or interethnic. There are other attacks that have been recently going on. The other attacks, in some cases, amount to nothing less than pogroms, where entire villages are driven out and or burned down with nothing left but ashes. These are mounted by military forces, by paramilitary forces, and sometimes by disgruntled individuals. Guns are rampant in South Sudan. It's not hard to get a gun, I've been told, in South Sudan. Further, I'm sorry that all this is so negative, but that's what it is. The next negative part to share is that pillaging, raping, and the abducting of children into child soldiering activities is quite common It varies up and down. We don't know how many people, but we know lots of people. Sadly, lots of women have reported rapes, and many, of course, are raped and don't report it because they're scared. We don't know how many children have become child soldiers, but we know thousands. We don't know how many thousands, but thousands of children have become child soldiers. And that means some of them are working for paramilitaries as child soldiers. Very cautious about the number of people who have died over these last several years, particularly since 2013, when the violence has been so regular. It's been intermittent, but very, very regular. Independence was gained in 2011 from Sudan, the new country of South Sudan. But since 2013 up through 2022, probably, I'm very cautious about the figure, probably 200,000 people have died, usually at the hands of someone else. Some, of course, have died of disease and hunger, but I'm estimating cautiously that as many as 200,000, often civilians, have died or been killed. So with that ominous current situation, I am now going to go back in time, if I might, and tell you a little bit about what's transpired, what led up to this. About just before South Sudanese independence in 2011, I was in South Sudan. I had the privilege of giving a lecture, a series of lectures on human rights, which, as Jim knows, and as Bob and Ray know, are one of my specialty areas. I had the privilege of sharing my human rights perspectives with South Sudanese pastors, military personnel, educators, everyday citizens, both men and women. We had a very good seminar, and other people presented on other topics too, such as leadership development. But when I was at that seminar, because I always try to bring back names of personal names, personal people when I make a presentation like this, so that it isn't just vast numbers who were died, vast numbers who were killed, vast numbers who were hungry. Well, of course, that's critically important. I want to give you the name of an individual, like I did a few minutes ago, Christine DeRay. This current individual at that seminar on human rights was named John Oryem, O-R-Y-E-M. And it turned out that John Oryem, an eager attendee, was a poet. And it turned out that he was a humanitarian himself, a South Sudanese humanitarian, just at the time that the referendum was taking place and that South Sudan was about to become a new nation. And I learned a great deal from John Oryem, because he told us, and I've used it ever since, that the metaphor of the tree is what South Sudanese people look at. The metaphor of the tree means that things flower, grow, blossom, get better, but also as limbs fall off, get worse. And I've used his metaphor of the tree to describe human rights. Human rights grow, flourish, but also are compounded and truncated and obliterated. So I learned a lot from John Oryem and his notion of the tree. And now I've written in subsequent years in my most recent book about the tree of rights. And so as we think of the individuals like John, I wonder 10 years now down the road, where is John? Is he alive? I have no idea. Is he dead? I sure hope not. I have no idea. An individual, a single individual, making an impact. Now, the reason I'm also talking about individuals is that, much like many of us in the US, and I'm sorry to make a little bit of a political point here, but it seems like some people get quite tied up in certain political persons' personalities. And I won't mention any names, but we can guess a previous president who was kind of a narcissistic kind of a guy that people got kind of tied up with, in my opinion. Much the same has happened in South Sudan. People get tied up narcissistically often with what they call big men. I'm sorry, ladies, these are not ladies, these are men. If the women were involved, things would be better. Big men are a big deal in South Sudan and its history, and back into the history of Sudan when the two nations were one. Big men who carry weight. One of the good big men several decades ago, he died in 2005, representing both Sudan and now South Sudan in their almost mythologic history, was a man named John Garang, Garang. And John Garang was almost a mythic figure in terms of his leadership, his support for Sudanese and now South Sudanese human rights, and his military prowess. When I went to John Garang's grave in 2010 and visited it with great reverence, as did all the other people visiting his grave in Juba, I then went just another 100 feet away from the grave and talked to some people who were in a line. And it turned out these people in the line had not only come to pay their respects to the famous John Garang, but also were lining up to register to vote in the referendum, which led, in fact, to South Sudanese independence. And those people said, we're looking for, this is now my academic term, they didn't use this term, a kind of cultural homogenization. We'd like to have a South Sudanese kind of culture as opposed to this ethnic group, this next ethnic group, this other ethnic group, rather than the Dinka or the Nuer or the Shilluk or the many other tribal groups by identification. And believe me, they're extraordinarily powerful. They mean a great deal to people's identities. So some of the people lining up to vote said, wouldn't it be great if we just had more of a kind of homogenous South Sudanese society where everybody could get along? Well, great idea. Very noble in the spirit of John Garang. It went down the tubes. Two of the other important people at that time and who rose even more powerfully as big men are the man who's still the president. His name is Salva Kiir, K-I-I-R. And one of the current vice presidents. Salva, by the way, is Dinka. This next man I'm going to tell you about is Nuer, and that's part of the tension between these two very powerful ethnic groups, Dinka and Nuer. The second man is Riek Machar, M-A-C-H-A-R. Kiir and Machar have dominated politics for the last decade since South Sudanese independence. And they've done it despite their admonitions that it was going to be for all South Sudan, at great expense to different ethnic groups, to different factions. And in my view, they've been as factionalized, if not worse, than any other previous leaders. And they continue, despite their statements, even this last week, that they're moving hand in hand toward future governance that will be better. The jury's still out on that one. Here are some other different sorts of big men who have made a splash. These are not from South Sudan. These are from the United States. You know, the actor George Clooney. George Clooney has done a great deal for South Sudan and put in funding to several key projects, including the Enough project with a man that I know. His colleague is named John Prendergast. John Prendergast and George Clooney have been among the leaders, as you might say, big men from the US who've tried to come in and help from a human rights point of view. What they've recently identified, and it's been going on, the next negative thing to share with you, is kleptocracy. There's a vast and relatively well-established kleptocracy. I now see my friend Ray Stransky has joined us. He's very knowledgeable on these topics. Hi, Ray. And the kleptocracy, extractive as it is ominous. And as far as George Clooney and John Prendergast have been able to tell through their organization Enough, which has done real good work, some of the greatest kleptocrats have been the senior leaders of the country. So corruption then is also a major part of the problem in South Sudan. Another big man I want to tell you about, because big men are so important in this history, is a man I met about just before South Sudanese independence. And his name was Sadiq al-Mahdi, M-A-H-D-I. In the tradition of the original Mahdi, the religious savior of the 1800s in Sudan, this Mahdi, Sadiq al-Mahdi, rose, became a very well-known figure. I had the privilege of meeting him when he was about 80 years old. We had a private dinner together. And he was the previous prime minister twice of Sudan. I mentioned him, we're featuring South Sudan here, but because his presence in Sudan, when South Sudan, of course, was still part of Sudan, was significant. But he was ousted. And another big man, Omar al-Bashir, basically remained dictatorial. I'm sure many of you have heard his name and are familiar with his name. He's now out. But believe me, if Sadiq al-Mahdi could have continued, I think things for Sudan and South Sudan might have been better. So these various big men in history have been very important, some ominous, some like Prendergast or Clooney or al-Mahdi have been, in my view, terrific. Then can you imagine if you're an everyday South Sudanese citizen trying to figure all this out? It's disheartening. The Comprehensive Peace Accord was formed in the mid-2000s, about 2005. The Comprehensive Peace Accord, or CBA, was intended prior to the referendum, prior to independence, to put things in a good position as people move toward independence in a few years. And I spoke to one of the authors when he visited Denver, at the University of Denver, where I was teaching. I spoke to one of the authors of the Comprehensive Peace Accord. His name was Roger Winter. We had a wonderful conversation. He was so optimistic about what was going to happen in the years to come, not only for South Sudan, but for Sudanese people as well. The Comprehensive Peace Accord was very well thought out, in my opinion, and had many statutes and mandates, which, if they would have been enacted, would have been real helpful. Most of those have fallen by the wayside. Oil has been significant in South Sudan and Sudan. Many of the South Sudanese pipelines have run through Sudan to get to the Red Sea. Oil, some people think, probably is, in terms of net value, South Sudan's single most important resource. Well, that's fine, except for the fact that they're highly unidimensional in that regard. And when the pipelines are cut off, as they often have been, when the Sudanese interfere with South Sudanese affairs, which has occurred, oil doesn't pump, proceeds don't flow, and the fact that the Chinese, who had a major role in the oil industry in this area, have both, in my view, helped the situation and hurt the situation, compounds the situation, because you have an important outside player. Not that the U.S. isn't an important player. We are. We've given over $100 million in recent years to help South Sudan. That's a significant amount of money. But China has been a major player, and particularly in the oil sector. And that's compounded things. You'd like to think that the oil revenues would then benefit, say, social services. There's virtually no evidence that I've come across that oil has somehow been transmogrified into benefiting via financing something like improved social services in South Sudan. That doesn't happen. Some of the oil money has flown into the pockets of the kleptocrats. So, as I move toward a conclusion of my presentation here, as of the 12th of September in 2018, a special type of transitional roadmap was put into place just 3 or 4 years ago, which is intended to improve situation, move these parties together, and maybe lead to some truly peaceful resolution. Well, that roadmap has a lot of components. I have them here. I won't read them to you. But it hasn't made much difference. They still talk about it. The two leaders I told you about, Kiir and Machar, wrestle with it, sometimes somewhat favorably, often not favorably. Most recently, here, in considering that roadmap, what's now called the transitional period, which means they haven't yet had the scheduled elections, which everybody thinks would be great, except for the problem is they don't hold them. Here most recently said just a couple of weeks ago, even I, as the leader, looking back, think that we lost focus after independence. We began fighting each other for power. I'm quoting him here now. We weren't building a cohesive nation, that's for sure. Well, him even saying that is one step better than it used to be. Then he went on to say, if we're going to move South Sudan forward in the next couple of years, perhaps from 2023 through 2025, he said this, and I quote, I consider the reunification of the army, constitution making, and the conduct of a census necessary to implement elections and establish a new government without reverting to war. Well, again, that's fine. People have been saying this now for a decade, particularly, by the way, I might say a census, as we know from our own country, is extremely important. And when you have 2 million IDPs and over 2 million refugees who you cannot easily census, even get a rough handle on, how will you then in turn empower them to vote? It's an absolute conundrum, which is extremely discouraging. I would be surprised if they have an election, and we hope in the next 2 to 4 years. I'd be surprised if more than 30%, this is my guess, if more than 30% of the eligible voters, potentially eligible voters, would actually get to vote. So, to conclude, and Jim has seen this before, and Ray has seen this before, and maybe both Ray Anderson and Ray Stransky have seen this before, but I'm going to show it to the rest of you good folks, and thanks for listening. Here's my cane. There's the whole cane from one end of the screen right to the other. Jim remembers when I showed this to the Golden Rotary Club. I was given this as an honor by South Sudanese people, including that man I told you about, Daniel Guy, who our friend Ray Stransky knows very well. And it was a great honor for me to receive it. He called it a cane of the elder. And compared to him, I'm definitely an elder. And he said, this gift, he said, we thank you for your training seminar in human rights. This was back in 2010. Thank you for the seminar. I said, well, it's my honor to present the seminar. And he said, there's one more thing. And they're both formal and friendly when they talk to you. So he always calls me Dr. Peter, not Dr. Van Arsdale. He always calls me Dr. Peter. He said, Dr. Peter, there's another thing when I give you this cane. If I give you this cane and you accept it, it means until the end of your life, you have to help South Sudanese people as best you can. So I'm trying to do that. And my life is not coming to an end anytime soon. So I've got a lot of years left to try to help. Thanks a lot.
Wow. Peter, I'm not sure, but what I may have missed the good news that you had earlier talked about.
Yeah. The good news is that a few people like John Prendergast and George Clooney are trying to help and are making some headway. There's a little bit of good news. To be frank, I don't think there's very much. There's good news with people like Ray Stransky, who works so hard through his organizations to help girls' education. That's some good news. There's a bit of good news, but I'm afraid most of it, as I see it, is bad news.
It's Ray Stransky through Project Education South Sudan. It's a phenomenal program that educates girls in Bor. Can you talk a little bit about the different tribes? Are the states also representing different tribes? Is there still a lot of tribalism? Are they coming together, or is it all narcissism?
That's a good question. You can imagine I put on my anthropological hat there, Jim, because anthropologists have always been interested. Not that we have all the answers, we don't, but anthropologists, as you know, are always interested in such things as tribal relations, ethnic relations, and that type of thing. Absolutely.
Know that you have another one on the call here, so continue on.
Oh, yes, that's great. Thank you. We have a good crew of folks here. I'm tickled to have our friends here. So tribalism is critically important. It's an ominous issue. Some people call it interethnic. Some people call it intertribal. There are a large number of tribes. Among the two largest, among the three, there are many, but among the three largest are ones I mentioned, the Dinka, the Nuer, the Shilluk. There are many others. But intertribal relations are tenuous. Interethnic relations are tenuous. People fall back, it seems to me, Jim, into their ethnic identities when things aren't going well transethnically. And it's a major issue.
As evidenced by our own country. How many languages?
Oh, gee, Ray, do you remember how many languages there might be? I'm not remembering for sure.
64 tribal groups. So they all have different languages. That's, I mean, there may be more varieties than that, but.
Yeah, many people speak Arabic, you'll be glad to know and interested to know. Many people speak English, of course, and other languages, but the multilingual society, that's for sure.
I'm interested in George Clooney. Why did he go to Sudan, South Sudan?
I think he was attracted, Barbara, because he really is a humanitarian and he knows a great deal about Africa.
That's true.
And I think also, I've got to say, because I know John Prendergast, he's been my guest twice in Denver, that John Prendergast is a very gripping, charismatic personality who's tried so hard to help that he attracted George Clooney, frankly, and they've worked so closely together. So I give great credit to John Prendergast. He's a wonderful fellow and he's never given up.
We have a couple of hands up. Quanta was first and then Vicky. Quanta, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is very enlightening.
Thank you, Quanta.
I have a question that may be sort of out of the realm of this conversation. And that is, for Rotary or any other organization that is concerned about the plight of the poor people in the world, there is a very important need to create a curriculum or a program that is culture sensitive about the science of family. And the reason I brought this up is I have friends from Africa. I have one daughter that I call her she has adopted me. That in Africa or even some other nations as well, I don't want to just point out to Africa, there is this male self-appointed rights to go every village and have a woman and then have many, many kids. I remember one of the ladies said, I may have 70 or 80 siblings, but I don't know who they are because my father has women, in all the villages. Now, this has to be done in such a way that it has to be created as a family science rather than birth control. And that people from developed countries not going to the women, and because when we look at suffering of the poor, there is always a woman that is holding a hungry baby in her lap. But that hungry baby in her lap didn't come without a male assistance. So therefore, is there a way that we can create, I'm 76 years old, so I don't know how much time I have. I hope I have more than that. I'm just bringing that as an idea. That local people, selected, educated, and open-minded, and willing to learn about male contribution to birth control, so that they understand that when you bring these children into the world, because the population of the world has quadrupled since I am born. And most of it is in the poor countries. So therefore, we do need to look into this idea, science of the family, science of creating family. And when it is done within that frame of mind, maybe people will be maybe 100 years, maybe 50 years, maybe 10 years, but slowly we need to change the mindset that a man can have sex anywhere he goes, and it doesn't matter how many kids are born into the world. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend any of the male colleagues in here.
Oh, you're not offending us. We're very interested in what you're saying, bringing it back to South Sudan. Of course, families are extremely important to South Sudanese, as they are to people elsewhere in the world. And family structures are very dynamic. Some have more than one wife, certainly. Many have extended families with various siblings, brothers, cousins, sisters, in large numbers, that's for sure. Family science, we could get into that for a whole, I like your point. The family science could be a whole different hour's discussion, that's for sure. So Jim, I'll turn it back to you.
Vicky, you have your hand up.
Yes, I do. Peter, I recently had the pleasure of taking a team of facilitators and delivering a series of 4 diversity, equity, and inclusion programs to South Sudan, Kenya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia.
Marvelous.
And because I always custom design them to make them culturally specific so that they have more relevance to the culture, I did research, and one of the philosophers that I found representative of South Sudan, I want to share this quote with you and see if you feel that this is accurate. First of all, his name is Duapchak Wau. And this famous quote of his, "The Republic of South Sudan does not belong to a particular tribe. It belongs to all the tribes of South Sudan. Those who think so should think coherently. The truth is, tribalism kills and destroys."
That's powerful. I'm with you.
Are you aware of him? Are you aware?
I'm aware of that concept. I'm not aware of him.
Yes.
That concept, yes, tribalism can be absolutely destructive. It absolutely. People are proud of their tribe. Well, of course, they're proud of their ethnic group. That's wonderful. But tribalism is ominous. And in South Sudan, it often is absolutely ominous. So thank you for sharing that important quote.
And the Rotarians from this District 9212 that encompasses South Sudan said that was very indicative of South Sudan to not embrace tribalism, but to see more of an inclusiveness.
And if they could, yeah, if they could, but they're not there. Many are trying, like my friend John Orium, the poet and humanitarian I told you about. He was trying so hard, but they're not getting there. They hope to get there.
But it's wonderful that I have a representative like this that's so highly published and acknowledged, because education is where it starts. And the fact that you alluded to the George Clooney's and the other people that are helping, thank God there are people within South Sudan itself that are
absolutely
to enlighten. And this particular philosopher is certainly one.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for sharing that. And you're right. There are so many good folks in South Sudan themselves, South Sudanese people, who are trying so hard, often against the roughest odds, to help. And they are to be admired.
And one question I would ask all of the anthropologists and all of you, when you have a country with 60+ languages, how do you meld into one?
You often don't easily. They remain fractionated.
I was going to say, like you said, Peter, though, they do have a common trade language that they use fairly extensively, not universally, but that the
That helps.
Sudanese Arabic and English now as a.
Oh, in English, okay.
Yeah, that certainly helps. It certainly helps, absolutely. But sorry to sound discouraged, but I am discouraged.
Is English
if-
very widely used? Is English very widely known?
Yes, among many, of course, that work for NGOs, many who work in schools,
Yeah.
many of the administrators. Yes, and of course, there's lots of representatives from the United Nations and other major agencies such as Save the Children and World Vision who are there, and they often do their work in English.
I have three hands seem to have gone up at once, and I'd like to have Greg, then Barbara, then Ray. Greg Klein, you have a question.
Yes. Is there an official national language or languages for South Sudan?
Well, I defer to what Ray Stransky
Yes,
was just sharing with you. Yeah, that's
Okay,
as close as Craig. That's as close as it gets. Yeah.
Okay. In answer to your question, the only example I can think of, I'm familiar with Tunisia, and it has 3 national languages. And are people trilingual? Many of them are, but most people are bilingual. Just an impression.
That's a
And
good point, Craig. When
Yeah.
I was doing my seminar in 2010, one of the young ladies who was well, they were all extraordinarily sharp. One of the sharp young ladies, when she got up to make a presentation about her perspective on human rights, apologized in English saying, "I'm sorry, my English isn't better. It's my 4th language." We acknowledged her greatly with her intellect and ability to speak 4 languages. So that does happen. And Ray Stransky knows that too. There are many people there who speak 3 and 4 languages adroitly.
very good. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Craig.
Barbara,
Thank you. My question is, are there Rotary clubs in South Sudan?
Nominally, what do you think, Ray Anderson? Is that nominal club or 2 that I've heard about in Juba, are they doing anything at all, or are they mostly on paper?
Well, actually, that was going to be one of my questions because I knew there was a Rotary Club in
Yep.
Juba.
Yep.
So I was just wondering if you
Yes, they're part of District 9212.
That's
Yeah.
correct. Yes, that's correct.
That's the one that we presented to that encompasses 4 countries, South Sudan being one.
That's right.
My
Exactly.
next question involves Vicky. Vicky, you've been there, you've seen the traumas, you've seen the horrors. What would you do now? And same for you, Peter, what would you suggest? You know, we hear of horrors that we think, oh, we can't do anything about, but I think we can. What is it that would help Sudan, South Sudan?
Well, I'll jump in there, and then I'd love to hear what Vicky has to say or what anybody else has to say. This has been a terrific conversation, and I'm glad we still have 9 more minutes to go. I'm keeping close watch on my watch to respect your time. My answer, and Ray Stransky will no doubt be glad that I'm mentioning this because he and I concur on this. We're close colleagues. We work together as we speak of things like what has been previously called Project Education South Sudan, now moving into a new organizational format, girls' education. I say this repeatedly, not just here. It's in Ethiopia, it's in Bangladesh, it's in Yemen, but it's in South Sudan too. If you can focus, if we, as Project Education South Sudan has done, on girls' education, if you want to pick something that makes a difference, and you only have one thing to pick girls' education. There's lots of other things, of course, that are important. If you had one thing to pick girls' education.
Thank you. That's what Shekar would have agreed with you 100%.
Absolutely. That was his big theme for
Right.
sure.
Vicky, what do you think?
Well, yeah, let me clarify one thing, Barbara, is I have not personally been to South Sudan. I have done online
Oh, I see.
diversity, equity, and inclusion seminars for South Sudan Kenya, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. So not having personally been there, but Peter, thank you so much. I wouldn't limit it just to women. I would say education is where it's at. I mean, the point that Quanta brought up about sex education, for one thing, you know, how babies are made and how you can stop having overpopulation. So whatever food there is can go around a little easier. There's so many realms of education that need to be addressed. Education across the board.
Thank you, Vicki.
And voters' rights.
Yeah.
Ray, I see, is your hand still up or up again?
I still have one more question. It kind of spins, Peter, off of your comments about the big men in the country.
Yes.
Are there any upcoming big women, to use your phrase?
There are certainly women working at the grassroots level, Ray, who are doing good things. But the history, and I don't mean there couldn't be, there could be, once these elections actually take place and we move hopefully by 2023, 2024, maybe 2025, I hope it's not later than that, into a new era, then I truly think big women some could have a role. But now, to the point currently, Ray, here's where I've seen women in key roles, and you can guess. It's with NGOs that are in places in Juba and elsewhere. I know of a young woman, I'll call her a big woman, who's working very adroitly, very successfully, but through an NGO in Juba. So right there, those avenues are well populated by accomplished women. But in terms of politics, that's a bit further down the road.
Thank you, Peter.
Quanta, you have another question?
I just wanted to mention that Dirk Lindenbeck is a member of Charlotte International Rotary Club, and Charlotte International is having a project in a village outside of Juba and repairing an eye clinic there. So
Wonderful.
there is a club, Rotary Club in Juba, because one of our members, I'm still currently a member of it. I'm in transition, but one of the members, Ann Evans, is working for many, many years. She's been working in South Sudan. Maybe you can have her one time. Maybe I'll give her email if you like. You can invite her. And so they're doing a great job, and there is a Rotary Club there.
Oh,
But
for
I'm
sure.
also,
For sure.
and also please think about the science of the family and teach male. And when the babies are starving, there should be include males coming in there and holding those babies next to their wives.
Let me tell you where that science of the family, to build on your good point, that I'm aware of, is taking place more systematically. And that's including Rotarians, and I mean including indigenous Rotarians in Western Kenya. There's some very much, to use your phrase, science of the family activities working with men and women around reproductive rights, around menstrual care, around hygiene education, as it focuses on water, sanitation, and hygiene. And much of it is done in schools, and young boys in the schools who are going to grow up to be the men that you're talking about, that need to be well educated around reproductive rights and reproductive issues, are on board. And in the high schools, of which several of which I'm familiar with, although I haven't visited them personally, my colleagues tell me that in those high schools, boys and girls through these health clubs are focusing on much of what Quanta has asked about.
I'd like to address Bob's question you put in chat, Bob. That would be good. First, I will mention, and I just want to briefly mention it, and Quanta, if you put in the lady's name, email, but also your own, if anybody would like to financially support, they have a grant, a district grant, and they're looking for a little bit more funds And so Quanta, if you want to put in your email, or Dirk, that they would appreciate any support that anybody may be willing to give. And then Bob, did you have a question, or do you want me to ask Dr. Ray?
And I would love to hear Ray share, because he's been on the ground in South Sudan with the girls' education program. I'd like to hear successes and struggles and time with that project.
Ray, give us some good stories.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to just keep it to a couple minutes here, but you know, we've been talking about the family and family science, and there is such a culture in South Sudan of a couple things. One, families have to be large because you have to have lots of kids because a lot of them are going to die off, and you got to have someone to take care of you in your old age. There's no Social Security. So there's such a long-standing culture of this that is very difficult to overcome. The second thing is that girls are there to learn how to be good, you know, mothers and home care people, and they bring in a dowry. You know, I mean, from 60 to 100 cows, you know, is the dowry, you know, that is paid to the wife's family. So, you know, it's not important for girls to go to school. It's important for them to stay home and learn to grind grain and do all that kind of stuff. So these are challenging things to overcome. So really quickly, one of the things that we are gradually seeing after, you know, we've had 140 graduates in the past 7 years. So that seems like a drop in the bucket. But when you consider that only 1% of girls in South Sudan graduate from high school, it's making a dent. And we're just seeing in the areas we've worked, just small changes towards people understanding that getting an education is important to becoming a good mom and to starting a small business and contributing to society. And one other thing, there is a group that is formed a number of years ago now called Women's South Sudanese Intellectual Women. And this is, it's a local group, but it also includes people from around the world who are expats, South Sudanese expats. And that is starting to create some energy around women's leadership, and the fact that women are now theoretically required to have a certain number of people in political elections. There are some tiny glimmers of hope, as Peter said, not very much, but
I think some of the so-called big women, to use that phrase that Jim is asking us about, Ray, they'll come from groups like that. People like our friend Helen, as you and I know, and others in that intellectual group.
Micklina Kenny.
Yes. So there's a glimmer. There's a glimmer, but it's a long way off.
If no more threatening questions or big questions.
Oh, there was one. Why only 30% voting? You actually alluded to that a bit, Peter. You mentioned because that's the only number that they would allow to vote?
No, it's because of access problems, registration problems, not even knowing where to cast your ballot problems. You think we have problems in the United States, and we do. I'm very, as I'm sure you folks are, open to voting rights that make voting as easy as possible. Believe me, and we got to keep, if I can make a political plug, keep pushing for that, my friends, making voting rights and voting access easy for qualified people. Vicky, back to South Sudan, Vicky. It's just with all of the conundrum of issues, the problems, the displacement, the person wondering where her next meal is going to come from those undernourished children.
I
My
think the
estimate, it's
question
just
is-
my personal estimate. I don't think more than 30%. That's just a rough guess. I don't think more than 30% are going to make it to the polls. I'm sad to say.
You mentioned human rights. Do they teach that in the schools?
Yes, yes. And I was honored in my class on human rights that I taught that some of those teachers who were in my class, Barbara, in turn took those ideas back to their classrooms.
That's really important. And we need a court of human rights. And I have people on my peacepodcast.org where they're talking about a court of human rights.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
And it would allow us to do more than just vote for political entities. It would allow us to say, my human rights have been violated. And that would be something that we can have conversations around. You know, what are your human rights? Here in the United States, even people don't even know they have human rights. So it's a
thank you for that. And I know we're trying to respect the time, but this is a terrific conversation. But my last point about human rights, back to that tree that I mentioned, the metaphor of the tree that John Orium, the South Sudanese poet and humanitarian, helped me develop. That tree as an educational tool, if I could humbly say so, is extremely useful. People like to look at visual things, a tree on a piece of paper with rights inscribed in their language on the limbs of the tree as it's flowering. That's a powerful educational tool, and it's being used, I'm delighted to say, in both Kenya and in South Sudan.
Thank you for sharing.
And in the last word, I don't know how many of you are aware, the very phrase human rights, those two words were first put together in the 1939 Rotarian magazine.
Really?
Eleanor Roosevelt saw that, read the article, because it was an article about how does Rotary deal with warring nations, with nations with Rotarians fighting against one another. And the article was about human rights, talking about we care not your politics, we care not your religion, but if you do not have human rights, then we cannot honor. But that was in the 1939 Rotarian magazine, from which Eleanor took some of the basics for the preamble to the human rights. Peter, we can't thank you enough. Yes.
My privilege, my privilege.
On and on and on. This was tremendous. And I always worry if I give everybody everything they want, they may not come back. But this could go on for hours and hours. But in respect for time and respect for the thoughts, this has been wonderful. We thank you. Next week or next month, we're also very excited. We've all are aware of the drought issues and the water problems and everything. There is a phenomenal conglomerate of people gathering together at Colorado State University in Fort Collins that are all Rotarians attempting to put together a program to get all the Rotarians up and down the Colorado River to work together to mediate the problems that we're about to experience. You may not be aware, but the Colorado Water Compact, which we have been following since 1922, is up in 2 years. So we're all struggling for water, 7% for agriculture. People are still moving out here in hordes. What are we going to do? When will the drought end? So these issues, there are some very key people led by Dr. David Stewart from CSU. He is the water engineer and major projects, and he will be our guest presenter. And what they're looking to do is, yes, solve the immediate problems, but we're looking for Rotary to be the mediators. Water issues are occurring everywhere in the world. Can we establish some kind of a concept that can be carried beyond? Again, we look forward to seeing you next month. And Peter, again, we thank you for a tremendous evening.
Thank you, Peter.